Is there any scenario in which a Canadian government in Ottawa could listen to Albertans enough that you'd give up that movement?
Absolutely not. We're at a point now where we're completely done with Canada. Albertans have been so abused and so hard done by the Canadian Confederation. That's why people are lining up for miles and miles and miles into the dark January nights of an Alberta winter. Right? I mean, Pierre Poilievre can get elected tomorrow, and he could give us our guns back, and he could undo the West Coast tanker ban, the emission caps, all the rest of it. That wouldn't change the imbalances within Confederation.
That's Jeffrey Rath from the Alberta Prosperity Project on this program just about a couple of weeks ago. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking to people related to the Alberta separatist movement. We also spoke to Cameron Davies of the Republican Party of Alberta, had them on to explain their reasoning. As you heard from Mr. Rath there, he's dead set on leaving Canada. Now, today, we speak to someone who's criticizing those separatists in Alberta, former federal Liberal leader, the man who was behind the Clarity Act as a cabinet minister, Stéphane Dion. He says he's criticizing those in the separatist movement, not only in Alberta, but of course here in Quebec as well. And he joins us now. The Honourable Stéphane Dion is on the line. Mr. Dion, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michael.
So, what are your thoughts? You know, when you hear Jeffrey Rath, or you hear Cameron Davies talk about Alberta separatism, what goes through your mind?
Oh, I am respectful of everyone, but to be respectful is not necessarily to agree. And I disagree with talks of separation and secession in a country as admirable as Canada. Of course, we have frustrations, difficulties, but you think these difficulties don't exist in the other countries, and they don't speak about splitting their own country. Only in Canada we have this habit, and I will fight it. It's wrong.
I heard you describe this as separatist blackmail and that you have no patience for it. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, it's when the government of a province said, give me this or that, otherwise the separatists will win in my riding and we will leave. I think that does not work. There is the belief in Canada that it works for Quebec, so Albertans said we are naive to not do the same. But in fact, I think all these talks about separation in Quebec is very negative for Quebec development and Quebec cohesion and our ability to be strong in Canada. I think it would be much better if all these talents and skills that are wasted for separation were used for strengthening Quebec in Canada and Canada in the world.
What do you think about the parallels and the differences? I'd love your insight here on the parallels and the differences between the Alberta separatist movement and the Quebec separatist movement that, of course, our listeners are so familiar with.
Well, in Quebec, it's clearly ethno-cultural. You have a population, the French Canadians of Quebec, who would be a majority if the international borders were limited to the territory of Quebec. So it's interesting for them to think, I may be a majority if we separate. Other Quebecers may support this movement, Quebecers that are not of a French accent, but the core of the support is that we will strengthen our language, strengthen our identity if we separate. In Alberta, it's a rich region that is concerned to give too much to the rest of the country, and where in the last years there were policies coming from Ottawa to try to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and that means to regulate more closely the oil and gas industry. And many Albertans are concerned by that. I think it's two different situations, but in both cases, separation is not the solution.
So, what would be the right way to counter the movement, and particularly for the movement in Alberta there, because it's not cultural, it's not based on language. What's the right way to counter that movement? Because they would say that they have real concerns about their economy and measures the federal government has taken against their oil industry.
I don't think it works when we say we will do this and that policy to mollify the support for separation. This will not work. What will work is to try to implement the right policies for Alberta and Canada. It's difficult to agree, I understand, but it's what we need to do. The last agreement between Alberta and Ottawa, if it's good for Alberta and Ottawa, do it. But if you think it will change the mind of the separatists, you're wasting your time. So that would be my approach. Don't cave in to separatist blackmail.
Mr. Dion, as I mentioned off the top, we had Cameron Davies from the Republican Party of Alberta on the show. Have a listen to Mr. Davies talking about those who are lining up to sign petitions in Alberta.
And so this petition, the threshold is 177,000 signatures that will force the government to then hold a Clarity Act compliant referendum on Alberta independence. And so we're doing that. As you mentioned on your show, the lines have been phenomenal. For freezing cold temperatures in January, lines wrapped around buildings. Small towns are coming out. In Edmonton, we've packed out, I think, 6 different hotel ballrooms in the first week of people ready to sign. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, we're expecting by the end of April, we believe will be over 500 to 600,000 signatures collected, which gives us a great launch pad into a referendum.
And Mr. Dion, as Mr. Davies mentioned there, Clarity Act compliant referendum. So and now let's bring up the Clarity Act. Of course, you were the man behind the Clarity Act. What do you think is the wake-up call for Albertans there when it comes to the Clarity Act and any pathway to actual separation?
The first thing I want to say, there's only one place in the world where it's so easy to have a referendum on secession, and it is Alberta. I don't know why Premier Smith decided to lower the bar this way, since she's not separatist herself. She created a situation where you may have a referendum on secession that is not in accordance with the overwhelming majority of Albertans. They don't want a referendum on that. But if you have this limited amount of signatures, then there's the obligation to have one. The likelihood that the yes vote would win is very low. You have seen the poll of yesterday. Mm-hmm. It was, I think it's 8% core separatists and 21% would think maybe they will vote yes. So it's very low. But you never know. And suppose that there is a yes. I know it's improbable, but suppose there is a yes. Then Premier Smith created a mess because there is no separatist government. There is no separatist legislative assembly. And even if it's true that the question is complying with the Clarity Act, the question is exactly the wording of the Clarity Act, the Supreme Court reference and the Clarity Act that gives effect to this reference did not envisage a situation where there is no separatist government. Because the first step after a yes vote is for the separatist government, the separatist premier, to ask to themselves, do we have a majority strong enough to invite the rest of the federation to negotiate secession? And who will do that? Is it Premier Smith? Or will she resign? Or will she call an election? We don't know. And she never answered clearly this very simple question that I asked to her. I asked her to answer in a piece I wrote recently.
What do you think of the premiers who are ambiguous, let's just put it that way, ambiguous in their support of federalism? Because it seems like Danielle Smith is trying to placate a certain part of her base that would be open to separation. I know people in Quebec would make some similar arguments about François Legault. You know, he's a guy that says we're never going to have a referendum, but people would say, hey, this is a guy that would vote yes, and he's leading the province. What do you think about those premiers that are ambiguous at times on that question?
I think it was mistaken for Premier Smith to lower the bar for a referendum on secession, because secession is not a trivial decision. It's an extreme one. It never happened in a well-established democracy. The secessions you had in the past, where when you have an autocratic or a totalitarian regime that collapsed, and then you have to make a decision, and you vote for secession at 98%, these kind of things. But to split a well-established modern state, democratic state, has never been done. It's very complex, very difficult to do. In Alberta, what kind of Alberta would emerge from that? We don't know. There are so many things to negotiate. It may take months, if not more than a year. to negotiate that. So you need to have a population very willing to do that, with the government determined to do that. And these conditions apparently don't exist in Alberta. So it was mistaken to go there. It's creating a potential big mess in Alberta and the whole of Canada.
Let me ask you if you feel there should be any criticism towards the federal government for, creating a country where we are right now, where you've got, a festering separatist movement in Quebec, and Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, his party, the PQ, is leading in the polls. There's been some weakness of late. And then you have this movement in Alberta. Should there be any blame, criticism leveled at the federal government, whether it's the previous Trudeau decade or now the Carney government, on how they handle the provinces?
Well, in Quebec, you have heard criticism on the fact that immigration was too generous, too open, and it created a crisis for the cost of housing. And maybe there are some truth in that, but then you change the government, or you change the prime minister, and you convince the government to change its policy. And now we have a policy that apparently is criticized the other way. It's too restrictive for immigration. So it's difficult decisions, and I don't see why we think that separation would be a solution for it. In Alberta, it's very difficult to come with climate policies that will create unanimity. Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Guilbeault, they tried something. You had a backlash, especially in Alberta. Mr. Carney is trying something else. We need to fix a terrible problem, humankind. It is how can we change the material basis of our civilization, which is oil, gas, and coal, fossil fuels, and it's burning the planet now. So what we will do facing that? It's a difficult situation, especially in Canada, because the concentration of all oil and gas extraction is mostly in Alberta, Saskatchewan, a bit Newfoundland. So it's not easy to find solutions, but separation, again, is not part of the healthy solutions. That's my point. Other countries have the same difficulties than us to come with climate policies that make sense, and they don't put the very existence of their country on the table as we do in Canada. And we are making a mistake in doing that.
Well, Mr. Dion, listen, I've had so many separatists on this program from Alberta and from Quebec over the last little while. It's great to get some balance on the subject from you. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much. And have a great day.
You too. That's the Honourable Stéphane Dion. Of course, he was the former federal Liberal leader and, of course, the man behind the Clarity Act after the 1995 referendum in this province.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years.
And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.